They said, "It's good enough for her," and I heard it as clearly as if they'd whispered it into my ear instead of over the open fridge door. The words landed soft and cruel, the way indifference always does. It wasn't shouted, no anger, no argument, just a decision made in the space of a shrug. And me, standing in the kitchen doorway, like a guest in my own life, pretending not to notice the container in her hand, the one with the faded date printed in a shade of blue that had already begun to disappear. 2 years expired, 2 years passed. So was their kindness. I'm 82 now, and I live alone in a small assisted apartment that smells faintly of lavender disinfectant and reheated soup. There's a plastic plant on the windowsill because they don't trust residents with soil, and on Tuesdays, a nurse comes by to check my blood pressure and to ask if I'm eating well. I always smile and say yes. Old habits die slower than people think, but that night, back then, I wasn't here. I was in my daughter's house, the one with the granite countertops and the smart refrigerator that tells you what you already forgot, that food spoils, that love spoils, that attention has an expiration date just like anything else left unattended. After my fall, she said it made sense for me to stay with them for a while. I sold my little bungalow, the one your father built with his own hands, and moved into their guest room. I came with 2 suitcases, my medicines, and a sense of gratitude so enormous it could have drowned me if it had weight. I didn't want to be a burden. I said it every day. She'd wave it off, that automatic managerial smile of someone keeping a schedule, not a relationship. I cooked for them sometimes in the beginning, simple things, stew, baked apples, soft bread, but soon she started hovering over me, rearranging the salt, explaining her diet rules, wiping the counter before I'd even set down a plate. I stopped offering. The kitchen became foreign territory. I sat at the table instead, hands folded, waiting for permission to be useful again. When she handed me that yogurt, it wasn't just a careless act. It was the final note in a long melody of small exclusions, the subtle lowering of my plate to the table after everyone else's, the way she'd serve the children first and tell me not to overfill myself, the look my son gave me when I asked for butter instead of the olive oil spray they used on everything. They had health routines, new rules for eating, sleeping, speaking. They spoke in slogans, low sodium, low sugar, low noise. The house was full of instructions disguised as kindness. I remember that evening perfectly. The television murmured some endless competition show. The kids were doing homework. My son was at the computer in the living room pretending to work. I asked if there was something light I could have for dinner. My stomach had been uneasy all day. My daughter opened the fridge, rummaged past the glass jars and the brand-name yogurt cups with fruit that came from who knows where, and she pulled out one old container from the back shelf. The foil lid was dusty, edges curled. She checked the date, laughed softly, and said those words I can't unhear. It's good enough for her. Maybe she didn't mean poison. Maybe she meant convenience. Maybe she meant nothing at all. But cruelty doesn't always mean to hurt. Sometimes it just means to not care. I took it from her hand because that's what I had learned to do. Accept whatever was offered. Smile as if you'd chosen it yourself. I ate half of it standing at the counter. It tasted off, a little sour, but I told myself it was fine. We convince ourselves of many things when the truth would make us lonelier. By midnight, I was on the floor of the bathroom, shaking so hard I thought I'd cracked a rib. The tiles smelled of lemon cleaner. The nightlight buzzed like a trapped fly. I called out once, twice. No one came. I must have passed out for an hour or more because when I opened my eyes again, the sky outside the small window was pink. I crawled to the phone, dialed the only number I remembered without looking. 911. My voice sounded far away, even to me. At the hospital, they asked what I'd eaten. I told them. I even described the label. The nurse blinked, looked at me the way people look at an animal they don't know whether to pet or pity, and wrote it down. Food poisoning, she said, mild to moderate, but my body doesn't handle mild the way it used to. My kidneys had to be flushed. My son arrived hours later with flowers from a gas station and a face that looked practiced. He said, "You should have told us you weren't feeling well." I said, "I did." He said, "Well, next time, be more clear." There was no next time in his tone. When I came home, everything was rearranged. My room smelled of bleach. My linens were gone. My snacks disappeared. My daughter said it was for hygiene. She'd left a new note on the fridge. "Please label what's yours so we can avoid confusion." That word, confusion, sat on the counter like a diagnosis. I wasn't confused. I was unwelcome. That's when I began counting the days, not by the calendar, but by what spoiled first. Milk, lettuce, the small portions of me they could no longer digest. Now, sitting here with my tea and my regulated window view, I think about that night not as the moment I got sick, but as the moment I woke up. The poison wasn't in the food. It was in the air of that house, the quiet resentment, the performative care, the way love there had rules of storage and disposal. When people talk about elder neglect, they imagine violence or shouting. They don't imagine a daughter smiling while handing you what she wouldn't feed the dog. They don't imagine the silence after, or the way a body can heal while the heart still festers. I do. I lived it. And though I left their house months later, that sentence still lingers in every meal I cook for myself. It's good enough for her. They thought I'd forget. Old women forget everything, don't they? Except we don't. We remember every tone, every pause, every polite betrayal disguised as fatigue. I remember the weight of that plastic spoon, the grainy texture of the yogurt, the aftertaste of aluminum and shame. I remember my daughter's perfume, orange blossom and antiseptic, and the look on her face when she saw me carried out on a stretcher, not horror, not love, but irritation, as if I'd broken something fragile she was trying to keep polished. So yes, I told the truth when they asked me what happened, not because I wanted revenge, but because I was too tired to lie for other people's comfort. I told them about the yogurt, about the date, about the sentence. The nurse wrote it all down carefully, as if it mattered. I think it did. Because once you say something aloud, once you stop excusing the small cruelties, something shifts. You start tasting honesty again, bitter at first, then clean. And you realize that you have survived not just poisoning of the body, but poisoning of the soul. That's where my story begins, with an expiration date and a sentence I refuse to swallow. I remember the smell of antiseptic more vividly than the pain itself, that faint sting in the air that seems to follow hospitals everywhere, the ghost of every disinfected wound and washed away confession. They kept me overnight for observation, though I hardly slept. The nurse came in every few hours, checking my pulse, adjusting the IV, murmuring something about hydration and rest. I nodded when she spoke, but my thoughts were elsewhere, on the refrigerator back home, on the small plastic container still sitting on the counter, maybe already thrown away, maybe waiting, like a piece of evidence no one would ever collect. The doctor said I was lucky it wasn't worse, that my age made recovery slower, that my kidneys would need monitoring. I wanted to tell him luck had nothing to do with it. I had survived worse poisons than spoiled dairy. I had survived being diminished daily in a house where I paid rent in silence. But he wasn't asking for philosophy, only vitals. When my daughter finally arrived at the hospital, it was almost noon. She carried her purse like armor, her face painted into concern, that public version of empathy she'd perfected over the years. "You scared us," she said, sitting on the edge of the chair, but not too close. "We didn't know what happened until the hospital called." I studied her eyes, not red, not swollen, just alert, calculating, scanning the room for witnesses. "The nurse said you got food poisoning," she added, and before I could answer, she went on, "It must have been something you ate on your own. You know you shouldn't eat things without checking with us. We've been trying to organize the fridge." The ease with which she rewrote the story stunned me. I had expected denial, maybe guilt, but this quiet rebranding of neglect into maternal protection, was artistry. "It was from your fridge," I said softly. "The yogurt you gave me." She blinked once, then smiled like a diplomat. "That's not possible. Everything in there is fresh." I wanted to ask if she thought I'd forged the expiration date, but instead, I looked at her hands, at the manicured nails painted a color called nude ambition, and realized she was too far gone into her performance to come back to the truth. My son came that evening. He brought a cardigan from the house and a thin smile that trembled at the corners. "You doing okay, Mom?" he asked, his voice lower than usual, the tone he used with customers when he was trying to sound patient. I told him what the doctor said. I told him what caused it. He sighed. "You know how you get sometimes, Mom. Things slip your mind. Maybe it wasn't what you think." I felt the IV needle in my arm pulse in time with my heartbeat. "I didn't imagine it," I said. "She gave it to me." He adjusted his tie, glanced toward the door, said something about stress and misunderstandings. Before he left, he kissed my forehead, the way you'd pat a sleeping child. That was the moment, the exact second, when something inside me shifted from hurt to clarity. Betrayal doesn't always announce itself with shouting. Sometimes it arrives dressed as practicality. I saw that now. That night, the nurse who had admitted me came back to check my chart. She was young, no older than my granddaughter, but her eyes were steady, the kind that have already seen too much. "Your daughter said she'd clean out your kitchen," she mentioned, almost casually, while taking my temperature. I nodded, feeling something cold settle in my chest. "Did you write down what I told you? About what I ate?" She nodded. "Of course, it's in your record." Her voice was gentle, but there was a shadow of something else there, maybe pity, maybe recognition. She hesitated before leaving. "Do you have someone who can stay with you when you're discharged?" I said I lived with my daughter. She just looked at me for a moment, then quietly said, "Make sure you have your prescriptions filled at a different pharmacy. It's safer." That small piece of advice landed like a flare in the dark. Someone had seen me, truly seen me, even if only in passing. The next morning, I signed the discharge papers. The doctor reminded me to rest, to avoid dairy for a while, and to follow up with my primary physician. My daughter was late picking me up. I waited in the lobby, sitting near a vending machine that hummed like an anxious heart. Across from me, an old man slept under a beige blanket, his wristband still on, his mouth open slightly, breathing the slow rhythm of surrender. I wondered if someone would come for him, or if, like me, he'd be escorted home by someone who called care a burden. When she finally arrived, she honked instead of parking. I walked out slowly, holding the railing, feeling the weight of every year pressing down, but refusing to bend. The drive home was silent, except for the soft buzz of the air conditioning and the faint rhythm of a talk show playing on her phone. When we reached the house, she pulled into the garage and didn't get out immediately. "You know," she said finally, "you really should have told us if you were feeling off. I had to throw out half the fridge because of this mess." The way she said "this mess" made me understand it wasn't the spoiled food she meant. It was me, the inconvenience of my existence. I nodded, too tired to argue. I walked inside, the familiar smell of lemon cleaner hitting me again. The kitchen sparkled, everything rearranged. A new sticky note was on the fridge door. "Please don't touch the back shelves." My shelf, apparently. That evening, when I went to make tea, I noticed my favorite mug was gone. In its place stood a generic white one from a hotel chain, the kind you don't mind losing. Small details, but that's how erasure begins, one object at a time. My medication was moved, my slippers relocated to a corner like a pair of forgotten shoes at a thrift store. The yogurt had been erased too, as though it never existed. When my grandson came in later and asked if I was okay, I told him yes, I was fine. He looked skeptical, the way children do when they sense a lie shaped like politeness. He offered to make me toast, but my daughter called from upstairs for him to finish homework. He left, and I sat there, staring at the refrigerator, hearing her voice again. The next morning, I opened the pantry and saw that the dates on some of the canned goods were also old. Maybe they had been sitting there since before I moved in, or maybe it was deliberate. Maybe it didn't matter anymore. I realized then that I couldn't rely on anyone in that house to feed me, not safely, not kindly. I made a sandwich with bread that tasted of the fridge, metallic and dry. I ate it slowly, deliberately, forcing myself to swallow each bite as a kind of proof. Proof that I could still take care of myself, even in a place that pretended to be a home. Later that afternoon, my daughter's husband made a passing comment while pouring himself coffee. "We've been talking," he said, his tone casual, "and maybe it's time to think about a place with more support. You know, where meals are handled properly." The irony of that sentence almost made me laugh, but I didn't. I just nodded, as if the idea of being exiled to a home was logical, inevitable, deserved. He left the room humming. I sat there until the sun began to fade, until the lines of light across the counter turned gold, then gray, then nothing. And in that stillness, the truth finally settled like dust. I was not family anymore. I was a liability. That realization didn't arrive with a scream or a breakdown. It came quietly, like the end of a fever. The betrayal wasn't just the yogurt, or the hospitalization, or the gaslighting afterward. It was the slow conversion of care into performance, of affection into obligation. They didn't want me to die. They just didn't care if I did, as long as it didn't interrupt their schedules. That night, I wrote the date on a small piece of paper and tucked it into my wallet. The date printed on the yogurt lid, and beneath it, the day I left the hospital. 2 dates. One marking what they gave me. One marking what I took back. Because that was the moment everything began to change. The poisoning wasn't the end of something. It was the start of my awakening. The first clear signal that I had to save myself from the people who called it care. When I came back from the hospital, the house had the strange stillness of a place recently rearranged to erase someone. There was nothing overtly hostile at first, no shouting or slammed doors, just a new chill that lived inside the silences between words. My daughter moved through rooms like a polite stranger, speaking to me only when necessary, her sentences trimmed of warmth. My son stopped dropping by as often, citing work, stress, traffic, all the usual excuses that bloom when guilt starts to rot into avoidance. The children were kind in the distracted way children can be, offering small smiles, asking if I was better, then vanishing back into their digital worlds. The house had grown colder, not in temperature, but in tone, a kind of moral air conditioning that kept emotions sterile. I noticed new labels on the pantry shelves: gluten-free, kids' snacks, pantry staples, mom's shelf, and that last one written in smaller letters, tucked in the corner near the floor where the light didn't reach. My shelf. I didn't touch it for days. I tried to resume small routines, folding laundry, watering the plant in the kitchen that always leaned toward the window like it was trying to escape. But each time I touched something, my daughter would appear and adjust it, move it 2 inches left or right, her mouth tightening into that line of silent correction. One morning she said, "I know you're trying to help, but it's easier if you just relax." Easier. The word wrapped around me like a thin plastic bag. Easier for whom? I began eating less, not from fear of food, but from the awareness that every bite felt observed. When I opened the fridge, I felt her presence behind me even when she wasn't there, a constant ghost of judgment whispering about portion control and contamination. A week later, she began locking the liquor cabinet. Not that I ever touched it, but it was a statement, a way of saying I was no longer trusted. Then came the new house rules pinned on the fridge with a magnet shaped like a smiling carrot: meal prep schedule, laundry rotation, bedtime noise limits. At the bottom, in smaller font, a note: "Please check with me before using the oven." I stood there staring at that line until my reflection blurred in the steel surface of the refrigerator door. Before using the oven. I had used ovens for 60 years without supervision. I'd roasted turkeys that fed 20 people, baked bread from scratch when flour was rationed, warmed bottles at 2 a.m. for the same man who now told me to ask permission to reheat soup. The quiet indignities accumulated like dust on a bookshelf. Every time I brushed one away, another settled in its place. I started keeping crackers under my pillow, small ones wrapped in napkins, because sometimes the kitchen was too busy or under cleaning. At night I'd eat them slowly, crumbs falling like snow on the bed sheets, a secret communion with my own stubbornness. I hid tea bags in my drawer too. One evening, when she found one, she laughed, genuinely laughed, and said, "Mom, you're like a squirrel." She didn't see the cruelty of it. Squirrels don't hoard out of greed. They hoard because they know winter comes. The first real confrontation came on a Sunday morning. She was cooking breakfast, pancakes for the children, egg whites for herself, and I reached for the syrup. She stopped me with a hand on my wrist, not rough, just firm. "That's the kids' syrup," she said. I looked at the bottle, the same maple syrup I had once poured over her pancakes when she was 8. "There's another kind for you," she added, pointing to a smaller bottle on the counter. Sugar-free, imitation flavor. I could feel my pulse in my throat. "What's wrong with this one?" I asked, my voice calm but trembling underneath. "You know it's not good for you," she replied, returning to her skillet. "We're just trying to help you stay healthy." That sentence, "we're just trying to help you," has been used to cage more women than bars ever did. I poured the fake syrup on my plate, watched it congeal into something that looked like ambered regret, and ate in silence. Later that day, I heard her on the phone in the living room, speaking in that lowered tone people use when they want to sound noble. "She's not the same since the hospital," she said, a bit forgetful, sometimes paranoid. I stood in the hallway, my hands cold, listening to my own life being rewritten in real time. The person on the other end must have asked if I needed professional help, because my daughter replied, We're considering options, maybe assisted living, somewhere with routine. I felt a slow fury rise inside me, not hot and explosive, but steady, the kind that could melt iron if you gave it time. Routine. The word sounded like exile with better marketing. In the following days, she began mentioning independence in the same breath as safety. She said it lovingly, as if wrapping poison in velvet. Mom, don't you think it'd be nice to have people your age around? Activities, friends, someone to cook for you. I told her I already had friends, though I hadn't seen them in months because she'd stopped driving me anywhere that wasn't necessary. She smiled, tilted her head, the gesture of someone about to win an argument. You know I just want what's best. I nodded, because arguing would only prove her point. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house creaked under its own perfection. I thought about the yogurt again, about how the body reacts instinctively to what it knows will harm it. Maybe that was what my heart was doing now, revolting quietly against the life they were feeding me. Around midnight, I got up, put on my robe, and walked to the kitchen. The light from the fridge painted the room in sterile blue. I opened it and stood there, looking at the rows of labeled containers, the curated order that left no space for appetite or accident. I wanted to find something that belonged to me. There, in the corner of the bottom shelf, was an apple. Red, slightly bruised, unclaimed. I picked it up and held it under the running water, watching the dust swirl away. It wasn't rebellion, not yet. It was reclamation, small and quiet. The next morning, I found my shelf reorganized again. My daughter must have noticed the missing apple. There was now a small sticky note where it had been. Let me know if you need fruit. Some things need checking first. That was the moment the quiet inside me turned into decision. They thought they were managing me, but what they were really doing was training me to disappear. I decided to stop cooperating, not in loud ways, in invisible ones. I stopped mentioning my doctor appointments, started keeping a list of my prescriptions in my wallet instead of the shared folder on the fridge. I stopped asking before making tea, even when she glared. I began taking short walks without announcing them, pretending to forget my phone. Each small act was a crack in the glass of their control, and through those cracks, I began to see light again. But cracks let air in, and air invites change. One evening, my daughter's husband confronted me at the dinner table. You left the gate open this morning, he said. The dog could have run out. His tone was gentle but layered with accusation. I didn't go near the gate, I replied. You probably forgot, he said, smiling as if he'd forgiven me already. I didn't respond. I just looked at him long enough for the silence to turn uncomfortable. That's when I saw the flicker of unease cross his face, the realization that I wasn't playing my role anymore. They wanted a docile, grateful elder. I was becoming something else, watchful, deliberate, uncooperative. In the weeks that followed, the tension thickened. My daughter began texting me reminders even when we were in the same house. Did you take your meds? Please don't use the washer after 7. Remember to stay hydrated. It was surveillance disguised as care. I started writing my own notes in response, tiny, sarcastic ones I never sent. Did you take your empathy? Please don't speak to me like a toddler after 7. Remember, I raised you. I kept them in a notebook under my pillow, my private rebellion written in shaky cursive. One afternoon, while she was out, I walked to the park 2 blocks away. It took longer than it used to, but the air felt cleaner than anything inside that house. I sat on a bench and watched a group of women my age feeding pigeons, laughing over something I couldn't hear. One of them turned, noticed me, and nodded with the casual kindness strangers sometimes share. That nod felt like oxygen. I realized then how small my world had become, how expertly it had been shrunk around me until I could barely breathe. I stayed there until the sun dipped low and the streetlights flickered on. When I got home, my daughter was furious. "Where were you?" I was about to call the police. I said, "I went for a walk." She shook her head, exhaled sharply, and muttered, "You can't just wander off like that." I wanted to say, "I can if I remember who I am," but I didn't. Not yet. That night, I sat by the window of my room and looked out at the street lamps glowing through the mist. Somewhere, a car alarm went off and stopped. The world outside was wide and indifferent, but it was free. I realized I'd been waiting for permission to live when all I needed was a plan. The first escalation wasn't a fight or an explosion. It was a quiet, steady decision, forming under the weight of every small humiliation. I would not die in that house. I would not let them shrink me into a cautionary tale of decline. I would leave. And this time, I wouldn't ask anyone if it was allowed. I did not leave on a burst of anger or in the middle of a dramatic night. The decision came like water finding its path, quietly but insistently. One morning, I was sitting at the kitchen table while the house still slept, the kind of silence that feels like an open wound, and I saw the light hit the refrigerator door. For a moment, I thought I saw my own reflection in the steel surface, small and blurred, a ghost outlined by morning. Behind that reflection was the note with the house rules and a calendar of meal rotations, all written in my daughter's sharp handwriting, as if my life were another household task to manage. I felt the weight of that image, myself flattened into a reflection of her control, and I knew I could not stay. Not because I hated them, though hatred would have been simpler, but because I could feel my edges disappearing, my mind folding itself to fit the narrow space they had made for me. Survival, for old women like me, is not about defiance. It is about remembering who you were before they decided who you should be. That same day, a letter arrived. It was from my cousin Irene, the only one still alive from the old days in Albuquerque. The envelope was thin and careful, the handwriting slanted but determined. Inside was a short note. She'd found an old photograph of us as girls and thought I should have it. The picture was sun-faded, but there we were, barefoot on her porch, both biting into peaches so ripe that juice ran down our wrists. I could almost smell the sweetness, the dust of that summer, the feeling of belonging to a world where laughter came easy and no one apologized for taking up space. I sat there at the table for a long time with that photo pressed to my chest, and something inside me shifted again. It wasn't nostalgia. It was oxygen. I thought, if that girl could live freely once, perhaps the woman she became could too. By afternoon, I had made a list. It was small at first. Get my identification, refill prescriptions, check bank account, pack essentials. I moved through the house quietly, methodically, the way one prepares for an evacuation they know must remain secret. I found my documents in the hall drawer, the one labeled Mom Stuff in black marker, as if the label made ownership transferable. My checkbook was there too, folded into an envelope with my name misspelled. I tucked everything into my purse. I packed one small suitcase, clothes enough for a week, my toothbrush, my medication, and the photograph. I hesitated when I reached the bookshelf. So many years of reading, of saving words that had once been mine. But in the end, I took only one book, a thin collection of poems Derek had given me decades ago when he still believed in anniversaries. It was enough. I left at dawn the next morning. The house was still, and the air smelled of fabric softener and something sterile. I paused by the kitchen, looking once more at the refrigerator. The light from the window caught the magnets, the bright ones shaped like vegetables and vacation souvenirs. One of them said, "Family is everything." I almost laughed. Family was what had brought me there and what had made me invisible. I turned away before the thought could sour. My suitcase wheels were soft against the hallway rug. No one heard me. When I reached the front door, I slipped the spare key under the potted fern and stepped outside. The chill hit my lungs sharply, but it felt clean. For the first time in months, I wasn't afraid of the air. I walked to the bus stop at the end of the street, dragging my suitcase over uneven pavement. The neighborhood was waking up. Joggers, sprinklers, children with backpacks, and not one of them looked at me. It was a kind of mercy, being unseen on my own terms. The bus arrived with a hiss, and I climbed aboard, heart pounding in my throat. I didn't have a destination in mind, only a direction, a way. I rode until the city changed shape, until the houses gave way to warehouses, and the glass towers turned into tired storefronts. When I saw the sign for the downtown terminal, I got off. Inside the terminal, there was the low hum of travelers and lost souls pretending to be travelers. I sat on a bench near the ticket counter and opened my wallet. I had $370 in cash, enough for a start. The woman behind the counter looked like she'd been awake since yesterday. "Where to?" she asked. I hesitated, then said, "Portland." I don't know why that city came out first. Maybe because I hadn't seen it in decades. Maybe because it sounded like a place where things begin again. "One way?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "one way." The bus was nearly empty. I sat by the window, the suitcase beside me, my purse on my lap. As we pulled out of the station, I watched the city slide past, the familiar streets of my captivity shrinking into distance. My hands trembled a little, but it wasn't fear. It was the body recognizing freedom after too long without it. The highway stretched ahead, endless and gray, but every mile felt like an undoing. I thought of my daughter waking to find my room empty, the bed made, the drawers bare. I wondered what she'd say, if she'd call the police, if she'd even pretend to worry. But I pushed the thought aside. That part of my life had ended quietly, like a candle that had burned out without anyone noticing. By the time we crossed into Oregon, the rain had begun. It fell soft and steady, blurring the landscape into watercolor. I rested my forehead against the glass and let the rhythm of the wheels soothe me. Around me, people murmured into phones, unwrapped sandwiches, dozed under thin blankets. I closed my eyes and thought of the peaches again, the sweetness, the sunlight on our faces. That was the first time I realized how long I'd been holding my breath. We arrived late in the evening. The terminal in Portland was smaller than I remembered, quieter too, like a place that had learned to lower its voice out of respect for all the goodbyes it had heard. I stepped off the bus and felt the cool, damp air wrap around me. It smelled of rain and asphalt and something faintly green. I stood there for a moment, clutching the handle of my suitcase, not knowing what to do next. Then I saw a small sign for a motel across the street, the Silver Pine Inn, vacancy. I walked toward it, my knees aching but my steps steady. The clerk barely looked up when I asked for a room. "One night?" he said. "Maybe more," I replied. He slid me a key with the number 14 written in black marker. The room was small but clean. One bed, one chair, a table with a lamp that flickered when I turned it on. I sat on the edge of the bed and exhaled for what felt like the first real time in years. The silence here was different. It wasn't empty. It was spacious, a kind of room made for rebuilding. I unpacked slowly, laying each item on the bed, as if introducing myself to my own possessions. I placed the photograph of Irene and me on the nightstand, and the book of poems beside it. I boiled water in the electric kettle and made tea from a bag I'd carried in my purse. The taste was simple, earthy, real. I drank it all, staring at the rain sliding down the window. The next morning, I walked into the city with no plan other than to keep moving. I passed shops, small cafes, people walking dogs. No one knew who I was. That anonymity was a kind of grace. I stopped at a corner bakery where the smell of bread was so warm it made my eyes sting. I bought a roll and ate it slowly at a table near the window. When the girl behind the counter smiled at me and said, "Have a good day," I almost said thank you twice. I hadn't heard kindness without conditions in so long that it felt foreign on my skin. That afternoon, I found a bulletin board near the bus station. Among the flyers for lost cats and guitar lessons, there was a handwritten note. Room for rent, for quiet lady, no nonsense, cash weekly. The phone number was scrawled at the bottom in heavy pen strokes. I copied it into my notebook. Back at the motel, I called. A woman answered with a voice like gravel and smoke. "You clean?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "No boyfriends?" "Not in decades." A pause. "Come by tomorrow at 4. Bring cash." When I hung up, I sat in the silence of the room and let the reality sink in. I had done it. I had left. I wasn't someone's burden, someone's cautionary tale, someone's faded reflection on a refrigerator door. I was a woman with a plan, with a bus ticket stub, and a chance. The fear was still there, coiled and cautious, but it had a new companion now, relief. As I turned off the lamp and lay down in the clean sheets, I felt that the world outside could be cruel, unpredictable, even lonely, but it was finally mine to face. I closed my eyes and whispered to no one, "You made it out." The rain kept falling, steady and rhythmic, like a lullaby written for the newly free. The room I rented was small, the kind of space where the walls seemed to listen, but it was mine. Joyce, the woman who rented it to me, was in her late 60s, with a voice that rasped like sandpaper and eyes that had long since stopped apologizing for anything. Her house was a 2-story relic on a quiet street, painted a faded blue that the rain had tried for years to wash away, but never quite managed. The front porch sagged in the middle, and there was a wind chime that sounded like someone shaking a bag of spoons. It wasn't elegant, but it was alive. Inside, the air smelled of lavender and old onions, a domestic combination that, for some reason, made me feel at ease. When I handed Joyce my first week's rent in cash, she didn't count it. She just nodded and said, "Kitchens shared, bathrooms at the end of the hall. Don't bring drama." I told her I'd run out of drama long ago. She smirked. "We'll see." That was how my new life began, not with fireworks or triumph, but with a key, a stranger's cat brushing against my leg, and the faint creak of a stair that would become familiar enough to count my days by. The first week was an exercise in humility and remembering. I had to relearn how to move in a world that didn't revolve around someone else's approval. Every morning, I made coffee in the little machine by the sink and drank it sitting on the front steps while the neighborhood woke up around me. There were children walking to school, couples arguing quietly in their cars, the mailman whistling an off-key tune. Ordinary life, the kind I had watched from behind glass for years, now unfolded at arm's length. Joyce didn't hover, and she didn't pry. She treated me the way I'd forgotten people could, like an adult who owed no explanations. A few days later, I saw a help wanted sign in the window of a small cafe down the street. The place was narrow and plain, the kind of spot people went not for atmosphere, but because it smelled like something their grandmother once cooked. I stood outside for a while, debating whether I could still be useful, whether anyone would hire someone with gray hair and hands that trembled slightly when lifting a cup. Finally, I pushed the door open. The woman behind the counter looked up, wiping her hands on her apron. "You hiring?" I asked. She studied me, probably calculating my age against the speed she thought the job required. "You have experience?" she asked. "A lifetime," I said, and she actually smiled. "Come tomorrow, 6 to 11. We'll see how you do." That first shift nearly broke me. The rush of orders, the clatter of plates, the steady stream of coffee that never seemed to end. It was overwhelming and strangely exhilarating. By the end of the morning, my feet ached, my shoulders screamed, but my heart felt steady in a way it hadn't in years. The woman, whose name was Heather, handed me a towel and said, "You did fine." I hadn't heard praise that simple and direct in a long time. "Can I come back tomorrow?" I asked. She nodded. "If you want." I did. Weeks passed. I fell into a rhythm. Work in the morning, walk home through the drizzle, share dinner with Joyce if she cooked too much, and read by the window before bed. I had almost begun to believe that the past would stay where I left it. But the past is like mold. It grows in the dark when you least expect it. One afternoon, Joyce brought in the mail and tossed an envelope onto the table. "Looks like you got a fan," she said. The handwriting on the front stopped my breath, round, looping letters I'd know anywhere. Kieran, my grandson. I hadn't heard from him since I left. My hands trembled as I opened the letter. It was short, only a few lines. "Dad and Mom are freaking out. They said you disappeared. I've been checking online every day. I miss you. Please let me know you're okay." There was a phone number written at the bottom. I folded the paper and held it for a long time. It was the first genuine thing to reach me from that family since I'd walked out. I didn't call, not then. But the letter stayed with me, tucked in the drawer beside my bed. It reminded me that not all love in that bloodline was spoiled. Still, it stirred something dangerous. Hope. Hope has teeth when you've taught yourself to live without it. The next few days, I found myself glancing at the phone whenever it buzzed, though it was never for me. I kept replaying his words, "I miss you," like a song I couldn't turn off. I tried to drown it out with work, with the sound of coffee pouring, with Joyce's nightly news blaring from the living room. But silence has its own persistence, and eventually the past found a louder way to reach me. A week later, I was wiping down the counter after the morning rush when Heather approached, holding a folded newspaper. "You okay?" she asked. "Why wouldn't I be?" I replied. She hesitated, then slid the paper toward me. There, on the front page of the community section, was my name beneath a headline that made my stomach twist. "Missing matriarch. Family fears the worst." Beneath it, a photograph of me from years ago, smiling politely while holding a pie dish. I skimmed the article, each line heavier than the last. My son was quoted saying, "We're desperate for information. She vanished without warning. We just want her safe." My daughter-in-law called me vulnerable and confused. I read the words again and again, my face burning. Vulnerable, confused. They had turned me into a ghost before I was even dead. When I looked up, Heather's eyes were cautious but kind. "You don't have to talk about it," she said. I folded the paper neatly and slid it into my bag. "I'm not missing," I told her. "They just finally noticed I stopped waiting." That night, I brought the newspaper home and showed it to Joyce. She read in silence, then laughed a short, sharp laugh. "You should frame it," she said. "Proof you exist." She poured us both a glass of cheap wine, and for the first time in months, I laughed too. It felt raw and healing. The article, however, changed something in the air. A few days later, I noticed a man lingering outside the cafe, a stranger in a gray suit, clean shoes, hair combed too neatly. He came in one morning after the rush, ordered coffee he didn't drink, and asked quietly, "Are you Mrs. Harlow?" I froze. "Who's asking?" He slid a card across the counter. "Derek Sorensen. I represent your family." I stared at the card, the weight of its politeness heavier than any accusation. "They're very worried," he continued. "They'd like to discuss your well-being, possibly your assets." My chest tightened, not from fear, but from the clarity of recognition. "Tell Adam and Lisa I'm not a lost dog," I said, "and my assets are none of their concern." He started to protest, but I raised my hand. "Leave," I said. "Now." He left without finishing his coffee. After he was gone, I went to the restroom and stood before the mirror. My reflection looked calm, almost detached, but my hands were shaking. For years I had tolerated their control, their small humiliations. But this attempt to reclaim ownership of me under the guise of worry, was something else. They wanted to bring me back, not out of love, but out of habit. They couldn't bear the thought that I might have built a life without their permission. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with Joyce and said, "They sent a lawyer." She didn't even blink. "Course they did," she said. "Money makes people sentimental." In the days that followed, small reminders of my old life began to trickle in. A voicemail from my son's number, curt and brittle. "We just want to talk." A letter from my daughter-in-law, unsigned but unmistakably hers, dripping with the kind of concern that tastes like acid. Each message carried the same subtext: return, apologize, resume your assigned place. I deleted them all. But Kieran's second letter was different. He wrote that he'd defended me, that he didn't believe the story they were telling, that he knew something about the yogurt, that he remembered how I always checked expiration dates when he was little. "You taught me not to take what isn't safe, even if someone says it's fine," he wrote. I cried reading that. It was such a small thing, but it meant he'd been paying attention. Still, the pressure grew. Another article appeared, this one more sensational, with a headline that called me the vanished grandmother. There was even a number for tips. Heather brought it in again, frowning. "They're turning it into a circus," she said. I nodded. "Let them," I said quietly. "Every story they tell makes mine easier to believe." She didn't ask what I meant, and I was grateful for that. One afternoon, after my shift, I found Lisa waiting outside the cafe. She looked smaller than I remembered, though her coat was immaculate, her makeup flawless. "Martha," she said, her voice tentative, "can we talk?" I stood still, the wet pavement reflecting both of us like ghosts. "You're talking now," I said. "Privately," she insisted. Against my better judgment, I led her to the empty booth in the back. She sat across from me, hands folded like she was at confession. "We didn't mean for things to go so far," she said. "Adam's been beside himself. The kids are worried. Kieran wrote to me," I interrupted. Her eyes widened. "So you know then, he misses you." "He's the only one who ever did." She flinched. "We thought you weren't safe," she said. "We just wanted to bring you home." I leaned forward. "Home? You mean the place where you fed me spoiled food and called it good enough?" The place where silence was the only thing that didn't offend you? Her mouth opened, then closed again. I watched her composure fracture in slow motion. "It was an accident," she whispered. "You could have died," I said, "and you would have blamed me for it." She looked down, eyes glistening, but not with real tears. "I just didn't want your shadow in every room," she said finally, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. There it was, the truth. She hadn't wanted me gone for my safety. She'd wanted me gone for her comfort. I stood. "Then congratulations," I said. "You got what you wanted." She didn't stop me when I walked away. Outside, the rain had started again, soft and relentless. I lifted my face to it and let it wash over me like baptism. That night, I wrote a letter. Not to them, but to Kieran. I told him I was safe, that I had found work and a place to live, that he should not waste his youth trying to mediate other people's guilt. I told him love could survive distance, but dignity could not survive humiliation. I didn't ask him to visit, but I told him he could if he ever came alone. I mailed it the next morning, sealing it with the steadiness of someone who finally understood the difference between loneliness and freedom. Still, there was one more act of reclamation to perform. The next week, I went to the bank. I opened an account in my own name, just mine, and transferred what little I had left into it. The young teller smiled politely, oblivious to the revolution she was witnessing. When she handed me the receipt, I felt lighter. Money, small as the sum was, had always been the chain by which they measured control. Now it was the proof of my survival. I knew the day would come when the story they had written for me, the one about the fragile, confused woman who had wandered off into danger, would collide with the truth I had been living. It arrived not as thunder, but as a letter, official and pale, bearing the cold emblem of authority in the upper corner. It was from Adult Protective Services. The words were careful, bureaucratic, almost apologetic. "We have received a report regarding your welfare and would like to conduct an evaluation to ensure your safety and well-being." I read it 3 times, each line pressing heavier against my chest. I knew immediately where it came from. Lisa and Adam had made good on their threats, cloaking control in the language of concern. They wanted to drag me back under the same fluorescent light where obedience masquerades as care. For a long moment, I just sat there at the kitchen table, the letter trembling between my fingers, Joyce watching silently from across the room. Finally, she said, "You gonna let them decide for you again?" Her tone was steady, not unkind. I folded the paper, slipped it back into the envelope, and said, "No, not this time." The visit was scheduled for Thursday morning. The night before, I barely slept. I kept thinking about the first hospital, about how easy it had been for them to twist my reality into weakness, how the nurses' questions back then had felt like a test I didn't know I was taking. This time, I would be ready. I laid out my documents neatly on the table: lease agreement, pay stubs from the cafe, receipts, medication list, and my bank statement. My small life, organized into evidence. Joyce stayed home that morning, brewing coffee and humming a song from the 60s that she probably didn't even realize she remembered. When the knock came, it was polite but firm. 2 people stood at the door, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a young man with a clipboard and an expression too eager for compassion. They introduced themselves as Ms. Graham and Mr. Patel. I invited them in. They sat in the living room, taking notes as they asked questions about my daily routine, my medical care, my work, my relationships. Each word they spoke carried that subtle tone of suspicion wrapped in civility, as if they were afraid I might break under the weight of my own independence. I answered calmly, evenly, explaining that I worked mornings, that I paid my rent in cash, that I managed my medication and meals without issue. When Ms. Graham asked if I had family, I said, once. Her pen paused mid-sentence. "Would you like to elaborate?" she asked softly. I smiled. "They prefer to tell my story for me, but you can see for yourself. I'm not missing, and I'm not unwell." I handed her the documents. She leafed through them carefully, her brow tightening as if something didn't fit the narrative she'd been given. After an hour, they asked to speak to Joyce privately. I waited by the window, watching the street. The rain had started again, a soft drizzle that blurred the outlines of the cars. When they finished, Ms. Graham approached me and said, "It's clear you're capable and stable. We'll close the report." Relief flooded me so suddenly that my knees nearly buckled. I thanked her, but she hesitated before leaving. "You should know," she said quietly. "The report came from someone very insistent. You might want to take steps to protect yourself legally." I nodded, the meaning of her words settling deep. As the door closed behind them, I turned to Joyce. "They won't stop," I said. "Then don't let them," she replied. That night, I sat at the table with my notebook and began to write. Not another letter to Kieran, but a statement. Every detail, every date, every small cruelty, from the yogurt to the hospital, to the articles, down to the lawyer's visit. I wrote it not as a confession, but as a record, the kind of truth that holds steady, even when people try to rewrite it. When I finished, my hand ached, but my mind felt clear. I photocopied the pages the next morning at the library and mailed one copy to APS, one to the hospital, and one, sealed with deliberate precision, to Lisa's workplace. She was a social worker, after all. Her profession depended on the illusion of care. The letter was factual, unemotional, signed in full. It contained no accusations, only chronology. But the truth doesn't need adjectives to wound. The days that followed were strangely calm, like the air before a storm that already knows its direction. I went to work, served coffee, washed dishes. Heather noticed I was quieter than usual, but she didn't ask. On the 5th day, Joyce found me sitting by the window with a cup of tea, staring at the gray sky. "You look like someone waiting for something," she said. "Not waiting," I replied, "just watching." The next morning, the phone rang. It was Ms. Graham. Her voice was measured but cautious. "We received your statement," she said. "It's thorough. We also contacted the hospital you mentioned. They confirmed your account. I thought you should know." There was a pause, and then she added, "You might want to prepare for some backlash." I thanked her and hung up. The backlash arrived that evening in the form of silence. My phone buzzed with a string of missed calls, all from numbers I recognized but didn't want to answer. Finally, one voicemail came through from Lisa, her voice brittle with controlled panic. "I hope you're happy. You've ruined everything. They suspended me pending investigation. How could you do this to your own family?" I listened once, then deleted it. There was no pleasure in her downfall, only inevitability. Actions have consequences, even when delayed by years of denial. A week later, I received another letter, this one from APS confirming that the case against me had been closed and that a formal review of Lisa's professional conduct was underway. I read it slowly, letting each word sink in. It wasn't vengeance, it was vindication. For years, I had swallowed indignities until they calcified inside me like stones. Now, one by one, they were dissolving. That night, I walked to the park alone. The air was crisp, and the world felt wide again. I sat on a bench and watched the lights flicker in the windows of nearby houses. Somewhere, a child laughed. Somewhere else, a door slammed. Life went on, indifferent but beautiful in its persistence. When I returned home, Joyce was waiting with 2 mugs of hot chocolate. "So," she said, "what happens now?" I smiled. "Nothing happens. That's the beauty of it. It's over." But even as I said it, I knew something had shifted permanently inside me. The woman who had once apologized for existing no longer lived here. The world hadn't grown kinder. I had simply stopped asking it to. The final confrontation came unexpectedly, as most things do. 2 weeks after the investigation closed, I was walking home from work when I saw a familiar car parked near the cafe. Lisa stood beside it, her posture rigid, her coat unbuttoned against the wind. For a moment, I considered crossing the street, but something stronger, curiosity, closure, maybe defiance, made me walk toward her. She looked smaller than before, her confidence stripped bare. "You got what you wanted," she said, her voice trembling with anger and something close to disbelief. "You destroyed my career." I shook my head. "No, Lisa, I told the truth. The truth destroyed your lies." She stepped closer, her eyes wet but sharp. "I took you in. I gave you everything." I felt a calmness settle over me like armor. "You gave me a place to sleep," I said. "I gave you someone to look down on." For a moment, we just stood there, the city noise humming around us, 2 women bound by blood and failure. Then she said, almost pleading, "What do you want from me?" I looked at her, really looked, and realized I wanted nothing. Not apology, not reconciliation, not even understanding. She had built her peace on my silence, and I had dismantled it by speaking. That was enough. "I want you to live with what you did," I said, "and I want you to know I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I won't carry you anymore." Her mouth opened, but no sound came. I turned and walked away, each step deliberate, steady, final. That night I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I sat at my desk and wrote a final note to myself. "They tried to erase you with neglect. You answered with truth." The sentence felt like a closing line, the kind that doesn't end a story but seals it. I placed it in the same drawer where I kept the photograph of Irene and me, the one with the peaches. The 2 belonged together, proofs of innocence, of sweetness, of endurance. In the days that followed, I felt lighter, as if my body had been carrying a secret weight for years and had finally set it down. People talk about justice as if it's loud, as if it comes with applause or headlines. But justice for women like me is quiet. It's a form signed, a voice steady, a truth unshaken. It's surviving long enough to see the ones who dismissed you forced to look your way again, not out of love, but acknowledgement. I hadn't won anything grand. I had simply reclaimed myself, and that, after a lifetime of diminishment, felt like the purest victory there was. When the mail came one morning, there was another envelope from Kieran. His handwriting was more confident this time. He wrote that he'd heard about the investigation, that he was proud of me, that he wanted to visit when the school term ended. "You were always braver than any of us realized," he said. I folded the letter carefully, placed it beside the others, and whispered to the empty room, "So were you." Then I opened the window, let the air rush in, and breathed deeply, without fear. For the first time in years, the air didn't taste like antiseptic or silence. It tasted like rain and something new, freedom, perhaps, or just the unflavored honesty of being alive. The seasons changed quietly, as they often do when one is paying attention not to time, but to peace. By the time spring returned, I had been in Portland almost a year. The city had softened around me. Its rain no longer felt like melancholy, but like cleansing, and the smell of coffee drifting from the cafe in the mornings had become the scent of my new life. I still worked the early shift, my hands moving with practiced rhythm, wiping down tables, pouring coffee, greeting the regulars who now knew me simply as Martha from the Silver Pine Inn, never as the woman who once vanished from a family portrait. Sometimes I would catch my reflection in the window as the light came through, and I barely recognized the woman looking back, not because she was older, but because she was finally unburdened. Her eyes were steady, her mouth neither apologetic nor defiant, just still. Joyce had grown into a kind of friend I didn't know I needed. We lived like two planets orbiting the same small star, each respecting the other's gravity. We talked in the evenings over tea, sometimes about the news, sometimes about nothing. She never asked about my daughter or my son again, and I never volunteered. The past had become a quiet ache, not a wound, something that only whispered in certain light. The letters from Kieran came regularly now. He wrote about school, about music, about how he sometimes missed my cooking. I kept every one of his letters tied in a ribbon in the drawer beside the old photograph. I never showed them to anyone. They were proof that tenderness could survive even the most poisoned soil. Once, on a day that shimmered faintly with sunlight after weeks of rain, I took the bus to the edge of the city. There was a farmer's market there, stalls lined with vegetables, flowers, and honey jars glowing like amber. I bought a basket of peaches, not because I needed them, but because I wanted to see if they tasted anything like that memory on Irene's porch. They didn't, not exactly, nothing ever does, but they were close enough to bring tears to my eyes. I sat on a bench, bit into one, and let the juice run down my wrist, just as it had when I was young. A man sitting nearby smiled and said, "Good, huh?" I nodded, unable to explain that what I was tasting wasn't fruit, but time. That peach was the flavor of recovery. The small sweetness that comes after bitterness has finally washed out of you. I no longer feared the mail or the phone. Sometimes curiosity tugged at me, and I would search my name online. The old articles were still there, but buried under newer stories. The world had moved on. Lisa had resigned quietly. Adam had moved out of state. I didn't follow what became of them. They had written their part of my story, and now I was writing the rest without them. One day, Kieran sent a photograph of himself standing beside a car packed with boxes. He was coming to Oregon for college. "Maybe I'll see you soon," he wrote. When he arrived that summer, taller and quieter than I remembered, he hugged me the way people do when they're afraid you might disappear if they let go too quickly. We spent a weekend walking through markets and old bookstores, and though we spoke about ordinary things, every word felt sacred. When he left, he said, "You're not missing anymore." I laughed softly and told him, I never was. In the evenings now, when the cafe closes and the city lights turn the wet pavement into ribbons of reflection, I walk home slowly, letting the rhythm of my steps remind me that no one is waiting to correct or monitor them. The small rituals of independence have become my liturgy, brewing tea, folding laundry, choosing what I will eat and when. I keep one apple always on the kitchen counter, a reminder that nourishment can be simple, that dignity can fit in the palm of a hand. The yogurt label, the one I saved, lies folded in a small box in my drawer. Sometimes I take it out, not to brood, but to remember. The expiration date, the symbol of everything that once defined me, has faded to near invisibility. Time has rubbed away the numbers. It comforts me to know that even cruelty, if left alone, erodes. There are moments when the past reaches out, not through pain, but through echoes. A certain scent of cleaning spray in the cafe, the shape of a daughter helping her elderly mother cross the street. I watch them and feel neither envy nor resentment. I simply hope that girl remembers to see the woman beside her, not as a duty, but as a mirror. Because that's all any of us are in the end, reflections of how love was handled when it became inconvenient. I've learned that people's capacity for care often expires faster than the things in their refrigerator, but the hunger to be treated with respect never does. It outlasts illness, betrayal, and even blood. Sometimes, when Joyce goes to bed early and the house grows still, I sit by the window and talk to the younger women who will someday be like me. I don't mean literally. They're the silent audience I imagine listening somewhere, across time or through some invisible thread that connects women who have endured small humiliations too polite to name. I tell them, never mistake being fed for being cared for. Never let anyone convince you that gratitude requires surrender. And if the world ever tells you that something is good enough for you, leave the table before you take the first bite. They might not hear me, but I hope they feel it. The pulse of warning and of hope passed from one generation's quiet survivor to another. When I go to bed now, I no longer double lock the door out of fear. I lock it gently, the way one closes a diary after finishing a chapter. I wake early, open the curtains, and let the morning light pour over the small room that holds everything I need. There's no audience, no witness, just the quiet certainty of ownership over my choices, my silence, my story. And that, after all the noise and the judgment, is what freedom sounds like. If I could speak one final truth aloud, one that could travel beyond these walls, I would say this: healing does not arrive with fanfare. It comes in the steady rhythm of ordinary days, in the confidence to eat what you choose, in the courage to tell the truth, and then to live long enough for it to settle into peace. I am not heroic. I am simply persistent. I survived long enough to remember my own worth, and that, I think, is the quiet miracle of being an old woman who refused to vanish. So I end my story the way it began, with food, not the sour taste of betrayal, but the sweetness of something fresh. Every week, I buy a single cup of yogurt from the market near the cafe. I check the date not out of fear, but from habit, smiling each time at how simple safety can be when one's life is their own. I eat it slowly by the window, watching the city move. Each spoonful is an act of reclamation, a ceremony of peace. I whisper to the woman I was, the one who once stood trembling in a kitchen where kindness had expired, and I tell her what she could never have believed back then. You were never too much. You were simply too alive for people who preferred things past their prime. And now, at last, everything I consume, everything I breathe, everything I am is mine and fresh and good enough for me.